Hello, and thanks for joining me. My name's Mr. Flynn, and I'm one of the philosophy teachers alongside Mr. Burke. And it's my job to teach ethics. Now, ethics is the branch of philosophy that looks at what is morally permissible and what is morally impermissible. In other words, what's right and wrong, really. And I thought I'd kick this session off by beginning with a very controversial topic straight away. And so our learning question for today is it right to torture people? And as I write here, surely not. I would have thought that nearly every single one of you would have grown up in homes in which torture would have been seen as repulsive. And so in today's little lesson, I'm going to put that to the test. And we're going to be looking at two thought experiments. The first one is called the trolley problem, a very, very famous thought experiment. And the second one is a more recent one called the ticking time bomb. Now you're probably asking yourself, what is a thought experiment? Well, thought experiments are used by philosophers and philosophy teachers. In DESC, we love them very much because they are kind of hypothetical situations which we create in order to test the logic of your arguments. And they work through what we call subjunctive reasoning. And they work by creating a scenario where you have to answer questions, what if? Now you might ask, why do we use these thought experiments? And I think the answer to that would be that they give us the conditions in which we will test the logic of your arguments. And we will look at the reasons that you give and see if they're consistent and whether they make sense. They are often very highly creative and unlikely scenarios. They might involve aliens or space travel or time travel, etc. But they generate very interesting debates, as you will see. Now, one of the great thought experiments is called the trolley problem. Some of you will probably know about it because it's one of the great thought experiments used to test people's ethical positions. And it was introduced by a very famous philosopher called Philippa Foot in 1967. And she used these trolley problems to determine what are the ethical principles that motivated people when they made moral decisions. I'm going to show you a video in a moment, but I thought I'd just explain to you why the trolley problem is so powerful. It's the idea that you have the capacity, you have the power and the ability to make decisions over people's lives. And as you'll see from the video, this is one of the most famous ones in which you control the lever. This train or trolley is out of control and you have the ability to switch the rails. So rather than killing the 5 people we have here, you choose to kill the first. Now you may wonder why this is so important. As you watch the video, you will see that it tells us so much about your moral principles. We'll talk after this video.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible. Now imagine the train heading for the workers again. This time it can only be stopped by pushing a very large man off a bridge. His great bulk would stop the train, but he'd die. Should you do that? Most people say no. But why not? Both thought experiments are cases of sacrificing 1 to save 5. What the trolley problem examines is whether moral decisions are simply about outcomes or about the manner in which you achieve them. Some utilitarians argue that the 2 cases are not importantly different from each other. Both have similar consequences, and consequences are all that really matter. In each case, 1 person dies and 5 are saved, the best option in each harrowing situation. But lots of people say they would switch the points, but they wouldn't push the man off the bridge. Are they simply inconsistent, or are they onto something?
Now, as we see from that video, the beauty of the trolley thought experiment is that it gets to the heart of the contradictions in our thinking. If we are concerned with saving human life, then as we saw, throwing a large man onto the track should be morally permissible. We should be able to justify that in terms of preventing a greater harm. However, many of us will feel intuitively uncomfortable adopting a position that gives us the right over other people's lives. And yet, in many ways, it is no different, really, from allowing the trolley to change track in this particular diagram as we see here. And it comes down to what are our ethical principles that underlie our decisions. Now, as mentioned very briefly in the video, one school of ethics in philosophy is called Utilitarianism. And very briefly, utilitarians are interested in the consequences. They're often called consequentialists. And their way of making moral decisions is to go on the principle of increasing pleasure and reducing pain. In many cases, as this diagram shows, they believe that you're able to kind of perform mental calculations. And so morality, therefore, becomes a question of working out the consequences. So if one person's going to die instead of 5, then your ethical problem is answered for you. On the whole, utilitarians don't believe in moral absolutes. So they would reject things like murder is always wrong. And so this is one of the main schools of thought. Now, the opposing position to utilitarianism, the main camp in philosophy, which is completely against the ideas of utilitarianism and the consequences of decisions being what matters, is what we call deontology or duty ethics. We call it duty ethics because it comes from this man here, a very famous German philosopher called Immanuel Kant, who you will study in some detail. And what Kant said is that rather than talking and thinking about the consequences of things, he felt that that was the wrong question, we need to look at what our duty was. And he invented the idea of the categorical imperative, which was something which meant that it was absolutely objectively necessary to do things in certain circumstances. And he felt that utilitarians were asking the wrong questions by looking at the consequences, because it might be the case that a killer goes into a house with the intention of causing harm, but he finds that the house is on fire, and in running out he draws attention to this and saves the occupants. Now, according to the utilitarian position, it would appear that that is an ethical piece of behavior. He certainly didn't intend that outcome, but what does that matter if we're thinking about the consequences of your actions? So Kant is far more interesting in the idea of your intentions, what's in your heart, what did you want to do? And Kant's way of thinking is very important for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which virtually every country in the world has signed. And that leads us on to our second thought experiment that we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the idea of torture. And you will notice here that one of the things that the Declaration of Human Rights does is it outlaws torture. And that's a position that's very popular with most people. And as I said at the beginning of this screencast, very few of us would say that torture is ethically permissible. Some of you will know that the United States in Guantanamo Island used a technique called waterboarding when they interrogated prisoners. And this led to a huge debate in the United States about whether it is permissible to hurt people to get vital information. And most of the world tends to stand against this position. So what is this next thought experiment? We call it the ticking time bomb scenario. And this is basically the idea. If you paid any attention to politics recently, or even if you've seen action films, you've probably seen this thought experiment or this scenario before, the ticking time bomb. And this is what you have to imagine, okay? There is a terrorist who is hell-bent on absolute destruction. Let's imagine that he's using a dirty bomb with nuclear radiation as being part of it, okay? You have to find out where this bomb is, because it's going to cost millions of lives. And now the question, the hypothetical question of this thought experiment is, do you resort to torture in order to get this information? So like the trolley problem, the ticking time bomb scenario is an ethical problem that focuses on a choice between two morally questionable acts. As I said before, it's against the law in countries like the United States and the UN. Now, we could even make this a more difficult scenario, and you can have a look at it here. I put the web address on. If we add one extra feature to this, and this is something that was included by a recent British newspaper. In this scenario, the terrorist in question won't respond to torture and asks if one would be willing to resort to torturing the man's wife and child as a means of extracting the information from him. Now this becomes a very, very difficult scenario for most of us. Again, coming back to philosophy, if we're going to adopt a utilitarian perspective and we're looking at the consequences, the torture of the terrorist or the torture of his family are completely permissible. And in fact, the pain that they will endure is negligible compared to the pleasure or the lack of pain, the sparing of pain to millions. So from the utilitarian perspective, our duty is clear. We weigh up the suffering of the terrorist and his family, and we think of this huge body of people, and we resort to torture. But many of us feel very uncomfortable with this. And it might be because we have this kind of Kantian sense that some things are wrong in themselves, that they are moral absolutes, and that the idea of taking out some pliers or some electric wire and resorting to torture, and even more so when we think of resorting to torture a man's wife or child, most of us would feel such a sense of instinctive repulsion at the thought of this. And we might feel such repulsion that we are not prepared to torture this man under the circumstances. Now, if you're interested in this, there's a BBC version of this thought experiment, and here's the address. I'm including it for you to have a look at here, looking at the ticking time bomb experiment, where they ask people from around the world for their views. And what's so fascinating is the complete lack of consensus. Many people decided that they would resort to torture under the circumstances. They felt as though there was such a pressing need to discover this information that they would go against some of their sacred principles concerning torture. And what was particularly interesting is that the results by geographical regions. So 1/3 of those questioned, 29%, think that government should be allowed to use some degree of torture. And what else they found is that support for torture occurred, according to how much violence, political violence there was in countries. For instance, 43% of people in Israel would resort to torture. 42% of people would resort to torture in Iraq. 36% of Americans. 32% in India. And in China, there was also significant support, with 37% of people saying that they would resort to torture. So what is so interesting about this is our complete lack of consensus. So one of the things that we will look to study in philosophy and ethics is, why is it that we have such different principles when it comes to the question of torture? Now, this has just been a brief insight into the fascinating world of the trolley problem and the whole idea of the power of thought experiments. I will leave it to you to think about some of these things, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing them next academic year with you in the philosophy classroom. Stay well, stay safe.